Welcome to For the Long Run, the podcast exploring the why behind what keeps runners running long, strong, and motivated. I'm your host, Jonathan Levitt. Through personal and professional connections in the running world, I have the privilege of getting to know some amazing athletes. I've always been fascinated by the psychological aspect of running, and this podcast is aimed at exploring this and much more. I hope you enjoy. This episode is brought to you by UCAN. If you know me, you know I'm all about personalization and not having a one-size-fits-all solution. That applies to training, nutrition in general, and nutrition for training, and UCAN is another tool in the toolbox I've loved over the years. Along with professional athletes like Alexi Pappas and Meb, I've used UCAN for marathons in the past and have recently begun incorporating their Superstarch into my day-to-day routine and before my long runs for steady energy. Superstarch provides long-lasting energy and helps keep your blood sugar stable with tasty summer flavors like cran raz, tropical orange, and more. I also love their bars, particularly the chocolate peanut butter flavor, as a late morning or mid-afternoon snack. Take 15% off your order at ucan.co with the code FTLR. Welcome back. Today I have a repeat guest joining me who holds the prestigious title of the most referenced man on For the Long Run podcast, Peter Bromka, guest of episode 10, I believe.
Awesome.
Peter, thanks for coming back today.
Thanks for having me again. Much different times, but I again have a Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee in my hand, so life is pretty good.
Of course you do.
Yeah.
So the last time we caught up on the podcast, you were it was in Boston. We were less than 6 feet apart, and you were getting ready to run on Marathon Monday.
Yeah.
Today is July 30th, and times are a little different now.
Oh, totally different.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I mean, I think what I see when I go online is like people who are existing either like in the larger existential world that we're in, like the actual world context or their own little context. So, I mean, I think like anyone, we struggle with things right now. But then I try to pop out of that and realize that I'm super fortunate and life is still really good for me. But I think, you still get dragged into feeling how you're feeling about like just the world. I mean, I was texting my good friend Patrick, who's on the Bowerman Elite that I'm on, and just saying that, we come to the East Coast every summer because my wife's from here and spend time with family. And then I said, it feels really weird not to be returning to a very big block of training on the horizon, because I've done that now, I realized, for 6 years. It's like you go east, you run some miles on your own, and then you get ready to come back and just grind through the fall. And that's been for CIM, it's been for New York, it's been for all these like amazing events. And so we're trying to think about like a way to recreate some of that, but it's certainly a whole different world.
Definitely. There were a half dozen things there that I'd love to dig in on. But let's start with what you shared first. We're in weird times. It's okay to feel how we feel, and we're all riding this roller coaster, but you do have to appreciate what you have. And with that in context, it's still okay to, like I've struggled, and the goal of this podcast today is more of a sort of state of affairs. Where are we? Peter and I did a very, very deep dive into his own why and exploring like why he runs and what motivates him about it, and particularly a lot about Boston in particular. So if that's what you're looking for today, episode 10 will give you that. This is going to be a much more topical conversation.
Fun, but I just have to stop you there. That's super fun to dive into, because I think I tweeted this at some point that I didn't realize until recently that I've been fortunate to be on a few podcasts that as the individual getting interviewed, if it's a long enough interesting interview like we had, it's super fun. It's like a little time capsule that you're able to, I'm able to go back and listen to that podcast, the conversation we had. And I mean, our conversation was a part of the weekend, this amazing weekend. That's sort of like I, in my memory, have a photo album of from beginning to end. And honestly, I was thinking about, I'm going to take you on a tangent, like Lindsay Krause was saying how, she's been posting about this wedding she has been planning, and then how it has been postponed, and she had been really looking forward to it as this like day that she could look forward to as an amazing day she would remember forever. And I, having been married, like definitely know that feeling. But I also said like I do that with marathons like once or twice a year. And I think of our conversation a few days before Boston as it's like a bell curve, like it's the lead up to this crescendo. And so I remember it fondly as part of this whole weekend that I hope to never forget. And it's fun to even go back to listen to part of that conversation where we dive into like how I got to running and how I came back to marathoning, because it was all part of this moment that I was hoping would go well and that did go well. And so it's super fun to revisit.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that. And the other piece that's interesting is the why changes too, and the reason you're doing it changes. I definitely want to get into like why are you doing it now? We were talking before we started recording, like we're grinding here through 73-degree dew points on the East Coast, and it's just brutal. And eventually, you'll come out the other side with some fitness and hopefully some Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee. But but yeah, we are in this weird time when there is no racing, and we don't know when racing will return as we knew it. We're seeing these photos and videos of races that are happening. It seems like only in Utah, but they're happening, and it's not what I like about racing. It's not what they're doing is they're just setting up a timed course. And that's, you can time trial that.
Yeah. It's like
what I love about racing is what you love about racing, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, having seen the photos of you running Boston, I get the sense. It's probably why we're friends. Like I've actually had people, close friends, be like, you might want to tone down some of the showboating to the crowd. Cause I definitely, I will say, as I've gotten more and more serious about my time at Boston, like really buckled down, I've like incorporated more subtle ways of like taunting the crowd. I now just like slightly hold my fingers to my ear, and
now you wink.
Yeah. Rather than like I used to. I mean, I think 10 years ago I once like jumped and whipped my hand around, and then like my calf seized, and I was like, that was a horrible idea.
So you and I have the same approach to that. There are photos of me at jumping up Heartbreak Hill, and like some of my like favorite photos, and then the same thing in Coolidge Corner. I was, it's like mile 23 and a half.
Okay.
And I ran that year with a charity bib. And so I was in the, 25,000s, and these people are running 4.5 hour marathons, and I'm, or 4 hour, whatever it is. And I'm like blowing their doors off, jumping up and down and smiling, and people are either like, holy shit, that's incredible, or like, fuck you, dude, like get out of here with that.
Come on, some of us are hurting here. And you're like, well, we're all getting different experiences from this. So it's
right.
I mean, exactly. I've been really trying to go through this tough process of thinking about how my favorite thing, which are major marathons, are sort of like gyms, like a packed gym at a concert, like while screaming, like while moving. Like it's all of the worst. All the things I love most about it are the worst things for a COVID era. And so there's people who, it's been really interesting to see. You talk to people about their why, but just like seeing people post about different time trials and virtual races on social media. There are different forms of races taking place, or tests, I should say. And then they appeal to different types of runners, and they have brought out the best in, different types of people that I'm like, wow, I certainly couldn't do that, but hats off to you. Everything from like these 5K time trials to people have done marathon time trials, to my friend Jason Iyer ran 200 miles in 7 runs over 1 week. It really, because why not?
Right.
And different challenges speak to different people. Unfortunately for me, being like a very social person, and it's only given me more time to realize that, like, yes, it's about the journey, and yes, it's about the like goals, but really if I were to focus it, it's about the experience, and setting yourself up to have like a crazy exciting experience. And so a lot of that is on hold. And that's why
because that piece requires other people, right?
for me, traditionally, I would say absolutely. But if I'm staring down a year of, I'm at the point where I'm thinking about signing up for Boston 21, hoping it happens in the fall, I guess. Because we don't need to like speculate here, but like, I don't think I'm going to want to go to a major marathon next spring. And so,
Right.
but I have actually turned a corner recently where I'm interested in maybe putting some money down on a bib, because of, I think, the accountability and the sort of like investment it would express. I hadn't had that interest at all until recently, where I realized like, I kind of want to put some dates on the calendar, even if they're really far out and even if they would move, I guess. Whereas before I was like, this seems silly. The world's in flux. I've gotten, I guess, used to some of the world being in flux, and I'm like, I don't know, I might want to put some stuff on the calendar. So I'm even thinking about this fall, like how could I, pressure creates, constraints create pressure, create opportunity. And so I'm like, okay, if I'm going to want to achieve anything this fall, how do I put some dates on the calendar, even if it's like 3 of my teammates and I are going to rip a 10K on the track. Because minus that, you're going to be like, well, I mean, I got to move that workout, and maybe we do the 10K next week. And I just don't think, I still might get kind of fit, but I don't think I would create nearly the same level of just marching towards a goal that I've been lucky to be a part of.
Is that hard for you?
Yeah, it's hard. So super hard. I mean, I've just had the time over the last couple months to think back on the last 6 years and how I've just layered, marathon cycle on top of marathon cycle, and how that's brought me all the way to the close to, an OTQ and all these amazing experiences. And so that's been hard, like for a lot of people. And then what I will say is I have this like Jaws style, like dun dun dun, which is that I turned 39 last week, and so there's a lot of unknowns about the relative performance ability of aging runners, but I wouldn't say like, well, in 5 years I'll definitely be better. It's just hard to say that. Part of my imagination still like dreams it to be possible, but objective markers wouldn't say it's likely. And so if you'd talked to me in January, I'd been like, screw masters running. I have zero interest in masters running. Like, I'll get there eventually, but I just want to keep ripping, and there's no reason to pick my head up. Let's just keep our head down and keep going. Now we all have too much time on our hands, even though we're like very busy with things, and to think about, what will the next stuff be. And I'm trying to grapple with that. What can the next couple years be? And honestly, how do I make sure I really think about it like, how do I do the things I need to do to not give up any of the fitness that I've earned over a lot of years?
Do you think that this break is good for you?
No, but I think it could be not horrible for me. I don't think I needed it. I think some people could really benefit from it. I think there's any number of ways that like runners could gain from this period. And also, like we talk about, again, you see a lot of people posting gratitude for just being able to run because it keeps their life in balance. And I think that's absolutely true and absolutely important. In the scheme, again, it's like if you pop out in the scheme of things, athletes missing seasons is not going to be like the biggest thing. But
there you are.
Oh, sorry. I think I lost
you.
Yeah. It's sort of like in an athletic context, you can be super frustrated, and then you do occasionally have to return to the life context where these are endeavors that only sort of matter. And so that's where you kind of seesaw back and forth between, I mean, I see it in my own Instagram posts that I try to be honest about. And I post like, and I'll look and be, expressing gratitude towards, safety and family. And then I also have posted over the last couple of months about how pissed I was because like dreams are deferred and you're like, what is this? I don't know what this is. And it can feel very like ungrateful, but it's also real. And so it's sometimes just processing that. And honestly, a lot of times I just post those things because I imagine other people are going through it too. Not to get sort of support, because I kind of have that amongst, close friends and people I can text and talk to. But to say like, if you're feeling frustrated like me, you're not alone. And this is real, even though like staying healthy, honestly, in the COVID era is the number one priority.
For sure. So you talked about disappointment and frustration. I'm curious to dial it back or look back to January and look at Houston. What were the minutes after that race like for you? And for context, Peter is the fastest
well, me and Jake
runner above 219. Yeah. Right. Yes.
There's another guy, Jake, who finished just ahead of me at Houston, who there's a horrible video of him sort of going head to hands to realize he probably just missed it, which is pretty heartbreaking. Shot by Billy Yang, which was pretty remarkable. So I have been trying to process this, and I write about my races a lot. I write about my running experiences, and I think a lot of that plays into why I'm referenced on this podcast a bit, is because I've put a lot of those thoughts out there and they're easier to reference and come back to. And to tell you the whole truth, the experience right after Houston was this sort of like shock of just like not knowing how to process what the world felt like, because it meant the dream that I'd been chasing for 2 years was finally over and out of my grasp. And so I have yet to post anything about, to write a piece or post a piece about it. And so what I actually did was wrote like a 6,000, almost 7,000 word piece in January and February. And then I realized like, this is not the piece I want to post. This is not the piece I want to share with the world, because what it is was just a process of working through the emotions and the experiences of the races in which I failed by 2 seconds to qualify, and then I failed by 19 seconds to qualify, and the incredible outpouring of emotion from like around the world to me, and like so much support. And it was way too zoomed in. I was caught in that moment, and I wrote about it, and it was okay. It was an okay piece, and I'm happy to send it to someone. But it didn't encapsulate the real experience that I hoped to. And so I went skiing with a buddy, before the trials, after Houston, which was like a total blessing, because I was like, oh man, I wouldn't have been able to go skiing with you guys if I had a trials race in 10 days.
Right.
And so we're sitting on the lift, like having a conversation, and he's like, you're getting out of a relationship. And I'm married, and I'm like kind of laughed because I'm in my late 30s, and I remember what that was like to be like, oh yeah, like, you're right. I was totally in this lifestyle for the last 2 years. And it's weird to say that, because as a runner my whole life, and then a runner of seriousness, like over the last handful, dozens of years, you always feel like you're living some part of a dream, or you're pursuing some goal. But then to like, from the start of clicking post on the essay Burn the Boat about how I was going to go for it, to the finish line in Houston, was this bubble that I entered, and then got so used to that it was just like the air I breathed. And then basically I can still picture it in my mind, like walking in the finish chute and getting the medal in Houston. And it was like an exit or a re-entry to the real world. and this sadness of like, I don't want to be in this world. I want to be back in that world, but that's no longer possible. And so that's what I've been writing about more now. And that's what allowed me to revisit those days and what all those moments meant. And like trying to thread the needle between the balance between like the micro moments that I think are really meaningful and I never want to forget, and also the larger experience and the larger journey. Because I actually think the second is more interesting. I posted on Instagram a couple times that I had written a piece called "The Meaning of Almost," which was like a working title I had for missing the OTQ for a second and third time by a handful of seconds. And then I realized I didn't know how to answer the question that I was proposing. I just thought the title sounded nice and it sounded like what I was writing about. And then I realized, like, I don't know the meaning of almost. Like, what a fraud. Like, why would I post a title that doesn't get answered in this piece? Because I don't actually think the meaning of coming close was what the experience was about. And so I'm writing about what that experience was, because that's what I gained from the 2 years. And that's what I think is like most special to hang on to.
So the piece, that's an interesting reflection on it. The piece that I've found on my end to be the most rewarding part of your experience. No, I'm joking. But the piece that I found most interesting from your experience is how unsurprising the outpouring of appreciation and gratitude and support has been, because you've taken people along for the ride, and that's what matters to me. That's what matters to the community.
Yeah.
And so this piece is like it's one of the reasons that you're referenced a lot on this podcast. And it was a specific conversation I had with Aaron Strout and a handful of other prior guests, where we were trying to understand men's distance running versus women's distance running. And it's fairly, it's an interesting reflection that Tommy Rivers is the other person that comes to mind.
Yeah.
When we think about going for the OTQ, and his community and our community has raised $300,000 for his family for his recovery because of him and who he is and what he brings to the community. And the outpouring of support that you had is similar in that you've lifted so many other people up and allowed so many other people to chase their dreams or burn the boat, as you say. And so I want to ask the question to you: why do you think you two are the only, or two of the only people that come to mind, two of the only men that come to mind in that discussion of, if you look at women's distance running, it's thriving because everyone's doing something awesome. And there are 500 women in the trials field, and it's at a place that it's never been before. And your friend is doing it, and your mom is doing it, and your training partner is doing it, and this and that. I don't know that we have that in men's running. And so I'm curious, like, why is it just you two?
I mean, it's a really good question around, there's the sport side of it. There's the stereotypical like male female tendency to share. We know that the men's and women's qualifying times were not relatively equal, which has all sorts of thoughts on both sides. I tend to think like I think it's largely agreed by the people who love the sport and want to see it grow and love celebrating the sport, that the women's time allowed for a lot more excitement, a lot more celebration.
Right.
Right. That said, I'm really glad that, I'm split, because I'm really glad that I've run sub 220 3 times. And I know that I wouldn't have if it had been anything less. If it had been 221, 222, you shoot for the standard. So it is interesting. I think that what we got to see I wish someone could like map it out. Like there was these waves of women qualifying for the 2:45 time, and then 3 years ago, fall of 17, and then 18 was a big wave, and then 19 was a huge wave, and then even women who went to Houston in 2020 for more. Like there was this crazy, like the door is open, rush through the door, and and so there's women who qualified that I didn't really know of much beforehand, and then in hindsight I've learned like, oh, they chopped the 13 minutes off their time in the lead up, and you're like, that's insane. But it's this idea of like the window to an opportunity on a dream is open, like rush in. And there's all sorts of women who just barely, missed out by small amounts, medium amounts, and still are like, oh, you know what? I chopped 23 minutes off my PR and I still came up 6 minutes short. And you're like, wow, I mean, I know something about what that's like. And that means you ran a totally different marathon in a totally different way. And that's really still awesome. And that's generally the sentiment. So I think there's a momentum factor to once more women started qualifying, then more women tried to qualify. And then more stories came out about it. The men's field, time being harsher and keeping the field smaller, you tended to get less crazy dreamers, like really qualifying. I wouldn't say you had, by the end, you had, like, there's been videos of the pack at CIM this year and just like how many men went out under pace through a half, through 15 miles. And there's like tons of men from all different parts of the country. And I know this happened at several races. So there was like some of that. A lot of them failed, and I'll just say like, the men's time was harsh enough that like most of the people who qualified like are damn good runners. You like look back through their career and you're like, oh shit, like you ran at that school, like, okay, not us. You ran at that division.
In that it's like fast enough that it's like it's not a breakthrough race. It's like this is somewhat calculated, right?
Yeah, you're like, oh yeah, you ran at that Division I school and you were all conference. Like, you had to put some things together to figure out the marathon. But like, I mean, I literally turned to some of the guys after Houston who had finished within 60 seconds of me ahead, and then like understood who they were, and you're like, oh, that guy's qualified twice before, like
right.
So he's run like a 64-minute half a couple of years ago, and now for whatever reason he left it to the last minute at Houston in this Olympic cycle. But like, damn, if he's not a good runner. So like, and I don't begrudge those guys; they're awesome. But yeah, there's multiple factors that, even in getting into like the whole controversy over the shoes, like you have this, essentially a bunch of women said like to other women, you realize like this time is actually achievable, even though it seems totally nuts, 2:44. And like these new shoes have come out, which I think there's absolutely a physiological component, an oxygen efficiency component, but there's also a like dreamer component of, this is going to make marathoning different than it's ever been. And so it allowed men and women to go after a time in a really exciting way. And that to me is like one of the things that I love about the new shoes, whatever brand, but I'm a Vaporfly original guy. And just like this idea of like, the marathon doesn't have to smash you in the face and you fail. That's like sort of how it was thought about forever. And now it's like people are figuring out different elements from the nutrition side, from the footwear side, and just be like, you can tackle this and don't be afraid to go after some bigger stuff. And so, yeah, I think then there's been some great storytellers to just, whether it, Ali Fowler brought on all these women in Atlanta, brought them on a podcast. There's been all these interviews with different women who said like, oh, wow, this dream is really a lot of fun, and we should go for it. And I will say though, even there's a side to it where wherever you set that number, you tend to congregate. So I've even talked to women who've qualified who are damn good runners, and I talked to some women at the Speed Project, for instance, who in Vegas were like, that's the hardest thing I've ever done. Like that was totally insane. And that pushed me in ways I've never been pushed. And these are women who had qualified for the trials, but they're really good runners. And the way the women's time was set, they were able to qualify without it being sort of like the utmost limit of their ability. And that's totally fine. But like, then they did that, they OTQ'd, and then they, went off in the desert and smashed themselves to figure out like, okay, what does the edge of failure look like? And
right.
Had really cool experiences elsewhere. So there's like, I do think it's just all to say, like, it's when these goals, bring people out of the woodwork and have their stories to tell. So like Tommy is a great runner. He's been a really good runner and a really champion of taking on goals for years. And he, I have, how do you say, like, I have so much admiration for him because he took on a lot of goals and he does it his own way. Like he did his pursuit of that goal his own way. Like I would be training in my lead up for CIM and I'd see him running in the Grand Canyon and like talking, on Instagram Live or on like an Instagram story about like, this is the run that fills my soul and that like rejuvenates my ability. And, the traditionalist in me and the traditionalist in a lot of people are like, it's not really specific enough training for like achieving the goals you want. But then he was also doing other races. I've had the time over the last 2 weeks to go through like the last 5 years of Tommy's Instagram. And what I realized is that like he had been operating at a level until his recent injury. Like he'd been hovering at this like really nice level of fitness where he could just like, he has an amazing like 9-story recap of a rock and roll race. Where is it? Like somewhere in Arizona, where he just like documents the marathon that he didn't even like enter until a week before because he was in that level of fitness. And then he just like, this is it was the first race I heard about him was it's from 3 years ago. And he shows up, he brings his family down, and then he shows up to the line and there's all these badass runners and he gets pissed. He's like, oh, I'm not going to win. It's not even worth being here. And then he goes out and he just like runs on anger for so long that he basically breaks all the other runners and they're like, screw this guy, like whatever. And he doesn't end up running like that fast for whatever reason on that day, but it's racing and he broke the other dudes. And he won, and it's just like he's recounting how he was running off of Eminem lyrics and anger and like anger towards his own life events, anger towards all sorts of things, but then like finding, appreciation and love by the end. It's a journey. And this is the first time that was the first time I learned about him, was someone pointed me to that series of posts. And then actually shortly after he went to the Boston Marathon and qualified, he ran sub 219, which was totally insane because, correct me if I'm wrong, you ran Boston 2017.
Yeah.
He ran 218 in 2017, which was like, you were on the
brutal.
It was so brutal. It was.
I was kissing the ground. It was so brutal.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've heard about it. Yeah. A lot of people went to the medical tent that day. It was a particularly like, it was so hot.
Sneaky hot.
Well, I recall it as like, it was so hot in Hopkinton. It was so like direct sunlight, heat radiating that guys are looking at each other like, fuck it, right? Like this is done. Like today's off, right? Like, no.
Right.
And everyone's kind of looking at each other like, "Are you sure we got to do this?" Now, you can look it up and they'll be like, it was only 74 degrees. What were you complaining about? But it's always that thing of like, you're coming out of the winter.
It's 74 degrees in April. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're like, your body is totally not used to it. And
it feels like 104.
And so sure enough, it like turns out that Tommy was training by run commuting 11 miles each way to his, graduate program and all these crazy things. But he just like threw himself straight into that and raged on with the pack and ran 218. And you're just like what? And he's willing to articulate that, and he's willing to throw it out there. And you can see how there is a positive feedback loop in storytelling that people who, I mean, I would include myself in this, like as I've shared more and gotten a positive response, it has enabled me to have the confidence to share even more.
Yeah, it's wild. Maybe it's not wild how it works. It's cool how it works. That's sort of the focus I've taken with social media as well. It's not a highlight reel. It's like, this is life. This is the ups. These are the ups. These are the downs, and everything in between. I've taken a lot of inspiration from you and from the group out in Flagstaff. With the Hoka team out there, with how Northern Arizona Elite, with how they approach social media. And yeah, it is storytelling, and it's totally meaningless to post a photo of your 8 to 10 mile run every day unless there's sort of a common thread or consistency between it. Sorry, it's not meaningless. It adds value.
Yeah.
If it gives you meaning, it's great. It adds value if you can come at it in this storytelling approach. And then there's this exactly what you were saying, bring everyone along for the ride and allow people to raise their own bar. I get a lot of messages, I'm sure you do as well, from people who appreciate the storytelling aspect and the like, hey, I'm going to put myself out there and take risks and whatnot. And I'm going to challenge myself to run sub 4 or to run a marathon or whatever it might be. And I think it's so cool that we can do that kind of stuff.
And I think you can get connected to different stories at different times that make meaning for you. I mean, one thing I think is worth highlighting always is like, it's okay to unfollow people, and it's okay to walk away from storytellers that are not helping you. I'll give you an example. Recently, I was a friend. She was posting about racial justice stuff a lot, and I just didn't really like her tone about it. She's very appropriate, and she's very she's pushing people to do more, but I didn't particularly appreciate her tone for a variety of reasons that just didn't really speak to me. And I mentioned it to a friend, and she was like, "Oh, I don't mind her tone at all. I think it's really good." And I actually think she's more talking to her other female friends who, in this case, she felt like are being sort of lazy in their activism, and just like she's trying to push them to do more. And I was like, oh, okay, that's totally fine. It doesn't need to be for me, and I can go find people who I'm inspired by. And I mean, there's a negative side of that, which is like the filter bubble element, but there's also the positive side of it. Like, you don't have to, things are not universally negative or positive. And I think that's what we see with all these different micro communities of running, where, sometimes people are inspired by people, and sometimes they say like, I need to unfollow this person. I had a friend who was going through a lot of health trouble, and she's like, oh, I had to unfollow you. Seeing you post about running just made me so sad. And I was like, oh, totally. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for telling me. That's just honest.
Yeah, I think I think it's important to remember that if you don't like what you see on your social feeds, you can unfollow people. I did that. I went through like a pretty large unfollowing spree in January or February. Just stuff like I didn't want to see. And, maybe I did or didn't know these people, but somehow I began following them, and it's your feed. You can mute them, you can unfollow them, whatever. I think that if it's impacting your mental health or your experience with a certain platform, you have every right to do that.
Yeah, I think it's great, and particularly as someone who starts to put out more content, I have to remind myself of that, because so for instance, what was it? 2 days ago, I posted a letter to Tommy, who's a friend who we're talking about, who's in the hospital, just as like a emotional expression of support for him. And I also emailed it to this email list that I started a year and a half ago, and I got like a very small number, but I got unsubscribed to my email list. And the part of you is like, all you did, there's not that many of you that have signed up for this email list, and all I've ever promised is I'll email you writings I have about running, and even if it's 1%,
It was a great email.
yeah, they're like, nope, this is not. I'm no longer interested, and I'm like, this is it.
So it's crazy. Of all things, that's been something that I've noticed to be kind of sad. As I've posted more about Black Lives Matter and
Oh yeah,
anti-racism and anti-Semitism, people unfollow, and it's like I saw a conversation with Noah Droddy this morning. Somebody, a guy, replied to Noah and was like, "Yeah, stay in your lane." Basically, hashtag unfollow, and it's like, really, dude? Like,
I think it's weird, but it's great, and it's yeah, I definitely saw that. I had a string of posts in late May, early June about. I mean, it's just such. All I'm reminded is that like any guys like you and me are like a little bit out there. And so like the moment
I'd say a little bit. Yeah.
sorry. No, I was going to say like we extend ourselves a little bit into sharing, and we get like a little bit of blood, a little bit of unfollow. We're definitely out there, and we're definitely goofballs.
Right.
But I'm always reminded when women will post online and be like, man, you should see the comments I get, or you should see the replies I get. And you're like, oh yeah, this is totally, I mean, my wife got pushback about something online recently, and I was like, oh, that's such a sweet, like you're encountering your first little like well, that woman doesn't know me.
Troll.
Yeah, like it was a disagreement. I'm like, so then I quickly I did a Google search of things people have said about me on Let's Run and sent it to her, and she's like, oh, how dare these people. And I was like, no, it's hilarious. You gotta laugh about it, but you go it helped put some things in context. And I know that's like, there's always orders.
It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. So
is what you're saying for us. Yeah,
exactly. And we're coming at it from a place of where we'll be fine. I mean, I think as we know, like I just mentioned, Let's Run, like anything that is a guy's going to experience on there is going to pale like, comparison to some of the things women have experienced on those boards. And so you just have to keep things in perspective.
Definitely. Thanks again to UCAN for sponsoring this episode. I've run 2 marathons fueled on UCAN and have experimented with it over the years and have found quite a positive impact on some specific health-related metrics that I'll be following again over the coming months. Typical sports nutrition products aren't something you would consume throughout the day, but many use UCAN as part of their daily routine for healthy energy. And I can't get enough of the chocolate peanut butter bars. Superstarch is the underlying carbohydrate in UCAN, and it provides long-lasting energy by keeping your blood sugar stable, and it is super easy on the stomach. Available in powder and bars, you can save 15% on your order at ucan.co with the code FTLR, like for the long run. One of the things that I've brought up a handful of times on the podcast recently is around what we're talking about, like how do we do better? And as people, who are out there and sharing and open and whatnot, what are the things that you've been doing that have, you might not have been doing them last year, or are there things you're doing differently that are now intentional?
Let me think. So in regards to racial equality and social justice that we were just discussing.
Yeah. Or in general. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the hard thing is I find it such a weird time, which we know it is. It's sort of like, why is this happening now, in the era of COVID, in the era of quarantine? And there's like a really interesting podcast, Code Switch, that did a like, why now white people? And
right. Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of reasons, including, like we have this time on our hands and the topic isn't changing. We're not able to run back to our lives. So I would say what I'm doing is not enough, but what I'm trying to do is read up on multiple perspectives. I have a strong, like a lot of things in my mind come back to like multiple things can be true at once. And I just find that to be like constantly this theme that is like, yes, but all of this that you guys are debating could really just be summed up with like multiple things can be true at once. So like reading about the white experience of racism or of race in America and in our history, I think is incredibly important because as a white person, it can be very illuminating. And then people have said like, you should read, Black literature, you should read Black, narratives that both are historical or just personal. And I think that's totally true. I don't think one negates the other. And I think it's sort of like for to each their own of where they are in the journey of trying to understand the context better. And then there's the constant reminder that, Black Lives Matter is not just some like graduate level education course for white people to be better.
Right.
It's about improving the lives of Black people. Now, I'd say like, if you're going to just start the clock in the spring, which is totally absurd because it should have started in much grander ways, much sooner. But just to say that like only some time has passed. And so it's like, how do you support ongoing initiatives right now? And just give yourself time to wake up to like, what are the ways that we could be better? But I find that really weird because at the same time, I'm like mostly sitting at home to avoid getting a pandemic disease, so that's like people are like, it's not about social media. And I'm like, well, let me talk to you about the people I'm not seeing in person, pretty much everyone.
Right.
So I think that's, there's a lot of, you and I are on social media a lot. And so a lot of these things can sort of explicitly or implicitly like be referencing social. Ideally,
right,
in a non-pandemic world, all these conversations are manifesting in like more meaningful ways in person. And that's where I really like, a friend of mine in Portland and I like would watch the daily COVID count in Portland. And I texted him a couple of weeks into the protests because Portland had sustained protests every day. And I said, like, we got to admit, these protests have not led to an outbreak of the virus like we were fearing. For any number of reasons, we don't really know yet why. But thank God, because there have been a lot of protests and people have been out there and largely they've worn masks and try to stay safe. But I think that is one way to really, I mean, it's so insane to be on the East Coast and to have my hometown in the national news being highlighted as all these things. And so
what's that like to see?
It's totally absurdist, basically. It's basically it takes, what you're able to see is that it takes everything as it is and multiplies it by 10, or in yesterday's case, 100, when the president says that like your hometown would have been gone if he hadn't saved it. And you're just like, well, this is, I mean, it just made me smile because it is horrible, but it's totally absurd. It's like the definition of absurd. So in some ways, it's this weird world we live in because I just like caring for my family. And I mean, I feel in some ways maybe ashamed about it, but I was not going to be, if I'd been in Portland the last 2 weeks, I was probably not going to be at the Justice Center, after 11 p.m. getting tear gassed, which is something I'm thinking about, something I need to give some thought to, because a lot of people were there. And I think overwhelmingly the pressure they're applying is well-meaning. And so as a result, a lot of what I would have taken in regardless would have been through Twitter and would have been through social media. Even though I'm like on the East Coast, I have friends who are like seeing the same things and they're 2 miles away from it's a very small portion of the city that is under this heavy level of conflict. And when they reference the 50 days of protests, it was a proud track record of, protests through the city. And there was, I posted a video of my son waving and like cheering for the protesters because they were going every night through different parts of the city in different directions. And then there were protests that were in cars where, people wanted to stay socially distant, but they would just drive through neighborhoods and honk their horns and have signs up. And so you're like, there's different ways of participating. And in a global pandemic, you got to respect all variety.
How did you explain it to your son, or did you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, he's 5, and we've been walking into those topics in, it's a great time to be alive. Like, I think we know that these topics weren't really broached when I was a kid, not really, not in the right same ways. So it's been an interesting time of just wading into, okay, we can talk about this man died because he knows about death. And then, interestingly, he doesn't understand the, justice system yet. So he'll routinely ask every couple of days, like, is the man who killed that man still in jail? And then he'll want to know, like, how long he's going to be in jail. And we're like, well, he's going to get a trial and we'll explain it. And it's an exploration, I think, for every family and every parent. We came up against the fact that, like, he asked how he died. And my wife just, like, realized in that moment she didn't really want to say because it was so uncomfortable. It was so dehumanizing. It was so painful. But then we worked through it and we explained, like, in age appropriate ways, like the danger that George Floyd had incurred and then how he died. So I just say, like, there's so many layers to it and there's so much work to be done. We have a great book about the lunch counter sit-ins called Someday is Today. And it talks about, I have as a storyteller, like, a big pet peeve of, like, I don't like any of these.
You're a storyteller?
Blah, 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 blah. This is my favorite. Is, like, on Let's Run, they'll be like, oh, let me hear your 6,000 word story about how you missed. And I'm like, it's funny because it's true. It's funny because it's true. But there are books about social justice that, like, are not really stories. They have characters and they tell facts, let's say, like, and then there are stories about where there's a narrative arc, there's tension, there's, an outcome. So there's a great one about this lunch counter sit-ins and how, they age appropriately describe, like, the violence they encountered, the harshness and the rudeness, like, people encountered at the lunch counter sit-ins, and why they were doing it, and then the result of, like, what came of it. And it's a great book because there is a narrative arc. There's characters you're, like, kind of worried about, and then they come out and there was actually, a great resolution. And so through books like that, you're able to talk about, like, all the number of ways and layers to how inequality has manifested over the years. And so it'll be interesting to see how this youngest generation, how they grow up in different parts of the country, and like, how they think about these things, having learned about them in more real ways from such a young age.
Got it. Yeah, I haven't asked that question, and I'm fascinated to know how parents are handling these conversations. So thank you for that. Switching gears a little bit, I am reminded of a Twitter thread from you back in May. So I'm going to turn around one of the questions that you had proposed. So basically the point of this is, you were on a Running Interviews podcasting rant. You said, podcasters, please make sure to dig in deeper with your guests. Find the details that they have experienced as runners that make them unique and interesting. Stop glossing over their journey. If they're pros, they've likely done cool stuff. This Twitter thread actually inspired me to change my guest list pretty dramatically. I had been pretty reserved and pretty set on only interviewing pros and making or elites, or in some cases sub elites, and or very high performing individuals in other careers, Lindsay Krause, Jen Miller, people like that, Aaron Strout. And this thread led me to think about all the conversations I had with the pros, because, like, I sat down with Kara Goucher and I was like, look, you've done some cool stuff in your career. We're not going to talk about any of it. And so I realized that the conversations I was having with the pros are not interesting because they're pros, but they're interesting because they are successful and they've achieved things. And I want to know what's allowed them to be successful, but they're just interesting characters and they're interesting people. And so, like, that's obviously not reserved to professional athletes. So I've changed up my guests quite a bit, and I'm trying to make it a little bit more mixed, but at the same time, still digging into those, interesting conversations. So, It's funny. You continued. Far too many interviews with runners sound like I started running young. Turns out I was fast. I turned pro. It's about the process, but really it's about the community. You said many of these things yourself. So,
Well, because I know it is. But I just have to jump in. That morning I had seen a list of, I can't even remember where. This person was like, we're gonna do a series of interviews. Here are the people who are going to be interviewed. And then the half dozen of list of names were all like pros who were badasses who'd done things. But what I realized was like that wasn't enough, right? And like sure, there were probably good interviews, but it's like it's just sort of, Carl Merber is a great example of like someone who's really interesting. He could like, you could throw him a ball of clay and he'll make something amazing out of it. But like he was just featured in the New York Times because he's gone through this experience of dealing with the setback of the Olympics and the Olympic trials being postponed. And so there's some...
It's the human aspect of it.
But it's also the events and it's the experience. If you said like, Jonathan Levitt, parentheses, some topic, some moment, some journey, someone replied to me about that tweet thread and they said like, Terry Gross tends to bring people on when they've just put something out in the world or just gone through something, or there's some point of tension that she can dig into, and not just like promote a movie, but try to say like, and we're going to hear about, the journey of going from mostly playing nice characters to playing a villain. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Because you're like, yeah, again, everyone's different. Like I have, like we were saying about social media, like I have I know enough about running because I've been around it my whole life that hearing how people got into running, it can be interesting for the backstory, but like I want to know, like what was Kara's experience like at those moments where she's really struggled and she's come out with, more and more stories about that. And then also moments of like, she's actually made moves in races to win global medals. And you're like, holy shit. I mean, maybe it's the same as, when I went from 5th to 3rd in like the league meet, but like probably not. And that's where I'm like, wait a second. So that's where like I geek out a little bit and I'm like, let's dig into the details. And not everyone agreed with me. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. But I think that for the purpose of this podcast, like that summarizes the whole experience. Like I really don't care about successes in the same way that another running podcast might.
Yeah.
I care about like what happens next, or how did you get there, or what are the takeaways. Like I tweeted this afternoon about the podcast I did with Alexi Pappas last week, and I said some of my favorite conversations are with pros who have reached a high level and are able to reflect and understand what has allowed them to get there. And in this episode with Alexi, she essentially outlined her roadmap for growth and success and failing and making tweaks and changes and getting better. And it doesn't matter that she's run a 2:30 something marathon or a 3:30 something marathon or a 5-hour marathon or a 10-hour marathon. Everything she said was accessible to anybody, even if you didn't run. And so like that's what I'm digging in for, and that's what I'm interested in learning. So one of the questions that you proposed in that thread is, when did they totally fail and what did they learn from that? So I'm going to turn the mic around on you. Let's hear your answer for that one.
I mean, for me, this most recent chapter of my running that I write about a lot has been really decently smooth and decently, it's been all these amazing little presents that I've gotten to unwrap. And now that I've had all these damn months to sit and think about it, what becomes clear is like, it's all a result of how much I failed in college and how much I literally called my parents, I think sophomore year, and I was almost in tears, and I was doing a lot of this. I was basically doing like journaling about like why running meant a lot to me. And I'll just say this in like a non-judgmental way. It was very like, basic. It was very juvenile. and I went through it. And so I'm criticizing myself, but just to say, like, when I read a lot of people's, like, what they're learning from running, I'm like, oh, I remember that. I just happen to have gone through that like many years ago. I was like, basically what I was trying to run as much as I dreamed I could. Because in college, like, you literally think like every day matters. And if you miss a day, I know we say like, oh, if you miss a day in the lead up to a marathon, it can feel bad if you're new to it. It's all the same themes. But like,
Right.
You're on a team, so a coach can only coach a team so much. He tries to do some individual coaching. She like tries to do the best they can, but like they really have to. So I basically spent multiple years totally inspired and totally burnt out. And I've talked about this a little bit, but like I can remember certain moments where, I had a 1500 indoor race where I just ran so crappy. Like I wasn't able to do any of the moves I wanted to do. I just got dropped, and sure enough, I was decently injured. Or like the bullet point list was my hips were out of alignment, my like stride was off. I ended up going home and like going through the emotional element of like journaling how upset I was, calling my parents and being like, do I not want it enough? Like I couldn't make the moves when I knew I needed to. And I knew the team needed me, and all this stuff that you go through as a team, on a team, or not on a team. Like people running road races that have poured so much in, and they're like, "Why am I doing all this? Why am I taking all this time away from my family, away from my career for this stupid 5K that didn't go well?" But then I, for some reason, realized like, wait a second, and I did some math, and I was like, I think I ran about 6% slower than I would have liked to or would have expected to, and I knew my hips were out of alignment. Like I knew my core and my just my stride was off. And I'm like, oh, it's so off, and that could easily be chalked up to 6%. Now I didn't know enough to know how to go fix it, and how to like.
And the 4% weren't out yet, so you couldn't have made that 4% gap right there.
That would have blown people's minds. That's the thing. Like, if you could have a time machine and go bring the alpha flag to the start of Boston
before they were banned on the track.
Exactly. But these things, yeah, like, so my whole, basically when I came back to the Boston bombing happened 2013, I was running, on a daily basis, but not really many workouts and not any races really. And I said like, okay, I want to run Boston next year. I need a qualifier. And I was in like decent fitness. And so I jumped into it, but I was like, I need to not, and it was actually a great lesson. I like qualified, but my hips got out of alignment. That's just my injury. Like everyone, what's interesting is Tommy Puzey talks at length about his training philosophy, and he always talks about stress fractures because that's what happens to him. That's how his body breaks down. I've never had a stress fracture. My body breaks down in other ways, probably before I even get to the point of stress fractures. And I know you've been just going through a journey like this, so anyways, I injured myself in the lead up to that just a little bit. And I was like, oh yeah, like you're not going to fucking do this again. This sport is not worth the mental anguish of being injured all the time. So you're only going to do it. You're going to like really, really watch that line, and not watch the line in like sort of the way you sort of said you were back in college of like, oh, I'm going to be smart this week. And then my buddy would be like, hey, want to run 12? And you had 7 in your mind, and you're like, yeah, I'll run 12.
Right.
So I just did that for so many years and went through so much emotional anguish as a result that I've been able to spend the last 6 years largely staying healthy and like really chasing down any little pains and knowing the signs of those pains early. So, I could dive into any number of races that I just failed spectacularly at. And like to the degree that like I used to I was lucky enough to go to the Division III cross country meet national championship with my team 3 years. And I was fairly injured by that meet most years. Like had different soft tissue injuries. My stride was off. Like, so efficiency is off. So you're just like wobbling at the back of the pack, and those experiences were so like frustrating because you're at the national championship. Like you want to be flying. for and you want to do everything you can for your team, but realistically, you're just going to kind of like be dragging your body around the course. And so I have had this amazing benefit of having like basically big chapters to my running career, which was like early where it had a whole bunch of mixed results. And then I've had this like able to have a much smoother experience the last 6 years.
That's awesome. Last question, I think, because I could go for hours with you on this.
We should just chat some other time.
Definitely. What are you looking forward to in the remainder of 2020?
Well, it's sort of what level are we talking at? But I mean, I'm hoping. I texted again my friend Patrick and said, it feels weird to be returning to Portland. I've been lucky enough to be able to be on the East Coast for a month, and not have this big major marathon on the horizon, and not have this, time frame to really build. But I do feel emotionally ready to take on like focused training and sort of living that lifestyle again. Whereas I was struggling, like a lot of people, in March, April, May, June, of like, what's it mean? Why does it matter? And if you have any of that, you can't really train at the level that you ideally would want to be at, if you're going to achieve something and use that fitness to pay off in big experiences. And so what I'm looking forward to in that micro element of my life, which affects all the other parts of my life, is just like having settled into this quarantine life enough to say like, okay, I need to stop being so angsty about like, what's it all mean and where's it all going to go, and just settle into that process again that I've been running, but I've been like gotten far away from where I was over the previous 2 years that I really enjoyed. And so I'm excited that we'll see, I like saying it out loud because it'll be interesting to see in a couple of months if I can hold to that. But it's been an emotional journey, like we opened this conversation with, around like, I was really looking forward to running New York, and I didn't have a bib yet, but I was looking at maybe doing a charity bib because I really wanted to run the 50th anniversary in New York. And I was like, that'll be so exciting. That'll be like a, rock concert of marathoning. And then you're like, oh, that's going to get canceled. And it all got pushed off. So I had been struggling with that. And I feel like I've come to a better terms of, we can settle into that rhythm of training hard, and put some goals on the calendar. So I hope to like try to figure out some goals that scare me enough that I can go after them, put them out there. And, but they're definitely weirder right now. I'm trying to figure out like what inspires me, and really put a line in the sand that like will scare me enough to get back to it.
If you had to choose today, what would it be?
So on my short list is I've never broken 15 for the 5K. And I put that was my dream of dreams in college. And I put that to bed, and I sort of put it behind me and said like, well, that's didn't happen in college, and my lifestyle has gotten in the way. And like, and then even as I've come back to marathoning, I've been like, it's a different type of training. But then last year on my birthday, I ran 15:08. And I was like, well, that was, and like, the 5K is like short enough that you're like within an hour of running when you're like, man, I want another one of those in a couple of weeks.
Right.
It's like, I kind of fell off the back of that wave and I want to ride it again. And so, that's one. And I think some of the guys on my team are inspired to, this is all like sort of COVID and safety dependent, like find ways to train for some speed. And we'll see what I can stand up there. And then this is totally, I'm inspired by like kind of random stuff. And so the two others were, the one I came up with was like, I'm going to turn 40 next summer. And I really like running 6-minute pace. So it feels weird to say out loud. So I'm like,
you can come pace me for a 10K.
so I'm like, could I run 40 miles at 6-minute pace.
Jesus.
And it's a little bit of a weird one because I really don't even know what I'm saying because I've never run over a 50K, which is 31 miles, and it was much slower than that. It was a trail one. So I hesitate. I didn't hesitate. I just said it out loud. But it's enough of you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it's just like it's crazy enough that you might want to do it.
I want to do it, yeah. And so I see people like PRing in the 10K on the track during quarantine, and I'm like, let me talk to you about how uninspired I am to go do that right now. Like that literally, you could say it to me on you could have a heart rate monitor on, and my heart would not move. I find it not interesting.
Is this guy breathing?
Yeah, like totally chill. But some people are super fired up about it, and they've gone after it, and they've run some amazing times.
As you say that, I'm like thinking about running a mile time trial as well on a track, as well as a road half marathon.
Yeah.
Those are like the things that are like slowly coming around. My half marathon PR is a 127 low, and I've run a 3-hour marathon.
Yeah.
So it's like that doesn't match up.
And I mean, you posted stuff that I suspected that. I mean, you had posted stuff about this buildup you're doing with the community leading into the fall, and I was like, it sounds as though Jonathan has aligned enough of the pieces that he's fired up and is about like finding the right course and going after it and caring the whole time.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's caring the whole time. So my original only goal for this summer was to run 30 miles on my 30th birthday with all of my friends on my favorite, like merging all of my favorite Boston routes together. Mm-hmm. Basically taking the train out to Waubun and running from Newton Wellesley Hospital on the marathon course, and then around the river, and then to Castle Island, and then finishing on the Esplanade at the beer garden there. Now, I have no desire to figure out how to carry that much water or get that much water, and I don't want to run it without my friends. So stop doing that. My coach just loaded in my birthday workout, and it is a 30-minute warm-up, a 30 by 1 minute on, 1 minute off, and 30-minute cool down.
Oh, that's sizable running.
I did a 15 by 1 minute on Wednesday, and yesterday, and I was like, by the 14th, I was like, I don't ever want to stop. This feels so good. So I think he took that to mean give him twice that.
Yeah, seriously.
But yeah, like what you were saying, like I haven't gotten excited about any sort of time trial or virtual racing until I've been thinking more about like, okay, I'm now pretty fit, and I'd like to go give that a test. Like I've been running 50 miles a week on 5 days of running, and biking like 6 to 8 hours on top of that. Wow. And so I feel pretty good.
Yeah. So you're like,
and so I'd like to give it exactly. So yeah, I think the whole point of this time is like, do what excites you, and if training doesn't excite you, don't train. But if you are able to find the excitement and fulfillment and joy in the training, you're gonna be pretty fit in the fall and the winter and next spring and whenever the races do come back.
Yeah. I mean, did you catch, I think if I caught this right, there was like a low key post by Des that she took a month off.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're like,
she said something like, oh, my first run in a month.
And you're like, wait a second. She has, she's on her own journey, sort of like on the back half of her career going like, what's the best way? I definitely look up to her like a lot of people do, but I look up to her as someone who's like similar age, and it's like, you're really, really, really going to have to trust your body's instincts at this moment in your career, because if it's off and you try to push, it's probably not going to sustain for very long.
Exactly.
So yeah, no, I think it's there. Maybe we could write this out, like the elements you need to have lined up. You need the fitness for sure, and then you need the inspiration, but then you need like the event that like just stokes your imagination in the right way. Yeah,
exactly. Cool. Where can we follow you if we don't follow your 6,000 word essays or your lovely Instagram posts?
I'm at Bromka on Instagram and Twitter and Medium. And peterbromka.com has all my writing, and you can sign up for a newsletter that I really only email out about my running thoughts. And you're welcome to unsubscribe if you decide not to follow anymore.
This podcast is brought to you by Peter's newsletter. Please subscribe and then unsubscribe.
Yeah.
Peter, thanks so much as always. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Awesome, man. Great to chat. Talk to you soon.
Likewise. That's it for today's episode. Like many long runs, it's sad when it has to end. I hope you join in next week on For the Long Run. And in the meantime, happy trails. If you've enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot to me if you shared it so that others can find it and enjoy it too.